This paper is taken from my thesis in general. Obviously, it's not my entire thesis. We would be here till next year if I read that out to you. This is just selected highlights, shall we say. So the reason I studied Thomas Hardy's men rather than his women is because there are so very many distinguished scholars who have come before me who have studied Hardy's women and written on them at length. I therefore felt rather than encroach on their very good work indeed, I would head in a different direction. So Hardy is generally recognised as an excellent delineator of the female. His intuitive understanding of the psychological complexities of women, such as Tess Derbyfield and Sue Bridehead, being emphasised at the expense of his male characters, who are often viewed as weak and two-dimensional by a number of Hardy critics. Needless to say, I'm not one of them. But what is less frequently recognised is that Hardy often examines men in their light of their ambitions, sensitivities, hypocrisies, and social expectations, giving voice to categories of maleness often elided in the work of his contemporaries. Throughout his 14 novels, he portrays androgynes, piners, female alpha males, unmen and men who have been othered, psychologically disturbed men, and empathetic men. Through such characters, he confronted late 19th century anxieties about the seeming destabilization of Victorian patriarchal conventions, which had seen challenges arising from the emergence of the new woman, the discrediting of religious authority by new evolutionary discourses, and progressive industrialization, which meant that occupations previously dependent upon physical prowess were becoming increasingly mechanized and thus marginalized. Hardy possessed an exceptional psychological insight into humanity, the man who used to notice such things. And Hardy channeled his mental energies into portraying not only the incredible, memorable female characters that we all know and love worldwide, but also exceptional male characters, such as Michael Henchard, Jude Fawley, Diggory Venn and Giles Winterbourne, and my personal favourite, William Boldwood, alongside men who aren't often critically discussed, like Will Dare, Aeneas Manston, Festus Derriman, Thomas Leaf, and Christian Cantle. So let us begin. In Victorian journals, novels, and magazines, the figure of the alpha male often comprised a particular set of requisites, such as an imposing stature, physical prowess, a deep, resonant voice, and, of course, a proud set of whiskers. Certain physical attributes, such as facial hair, were perceived as indicators of virility. Beards and moustaches were potent symbols of manliness for a modern industrial age. And by 1900, nearly 100% of men wore whiskers in some form. An ideology of beards began to be articulated, with a number of publications claiming beards to be an integral element of masculinity. Hardy had rather a lot of fun with this. Just picture the bombastic Festus Derriman constantly dashing his wig and dashing his whiskers, and bearded though he may be, is there a more effete and insufferable prig in all of Hardy's oeuvre than Henry Knight from A Pair of Blue Eyes? In 1865, John Ruskin wrote that, I've gone the wrong way, please forgive me. There we go. And I'll get rid of that as well so you can't see that. John Ruskin wrote that man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, the creator, the discoverer, the defender. His energy for invention, for war, for conquest. Hardy problematized these notions of the alpha male as a figure of patriarchal authority throughout his novels. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Alec d'Urberville and Angel Clare comprise a dichotomy. Alec is the villainous lover who ruins the maid Tess, and Angel is the virtuous lover who rescues her from what may have become a life of drudgery, a staple of many 19th century romances. However, I think Hardy undermines these stereotypes. To many of Hardy's contemporaries, Alec was simply a stock villain. Mowbray Morris described him as a coarse sexual brute, and in February 1892 issue of Punch magazine, Alec's character received such epithets as unconscionable scoundrel, dastardly ruffian, and a villain of the deepest dye. But this particular protagonist is in fact possessed of a contradictory nature, unable to reconcile the opposing poles of his psychosexual nature. As a lover, he is both gentleman and cad, and though his intentions with regards to Tess may not be entirely condonable, they are not hypocritical. Alec is presented in the novel as a philanderer who may or may not have committed rape. The jury will forever be out on that one. Yet he later becomes a religious convert under the instruction of Parson Clare and takes up preaching. While tending toward the zealous, he never doubts that he is speaking anything other than the truth. And even after renouncing religion, he still wishes to honour Tess with the recreational act of marriage. Will you put it in my power to make the only amends I can make for the trick I played on you? That is, will you be my wife? Alec's remorse when he learns of Tess's misery on account of his misdeed is genuine. For Alec, in spite of his vices, is not a hypocrite. That particular title I think we can reserve for the rather sanctimonious Angel Clare. The character of Angel Clare is the binary opposite to that of Alec d'Urberville, and he too is a highly challenging creation. In the first half of the novel, during the idyllic period spent at Talbot Hayes Dairy, Angel appears to Tess as a form of saviour, the lover in romantic fiction who rescues the heroine from the fate usually reserved for fallen women, madness or death. But Angel measures Tess by a gendered standard of Victorian femininity, which is, quite frankly, very horridly Ruskinian. Hardy portrays Angel as an idealist who has placed Tess upon a pedestal, an idealism that ultimately proves fatal. For it is Angel's rejection of Tess on their wedding night, supposedly on moral grounds, which leads to Tess finally committing murder and subsequently being hanged for the crime. For Angel, his dear Tessie is to be made a well-read woman before he carries her off as his property. But after Tessa's wedding night confession of sexual relations with Alec, the full extent of Angel's priggishness is realised. She ceases to be his dear possession and instead becomes another woman in your shape. The wedding night exchange illustrates how firmly the Victorian sexual double standard had become entrenched within the contemporary consciousness. Authors like Hardy were able to use fiction to expose such inherent contradictions, part of what he termed his demolition of the doll of English fiction. In contrast with Tessa's presentation as the pure woman of that novel's subtitle, Arabella Don is the lover as uninhibited sexual being. Her character is represented as being forthright, practical, and a survivor who flies in the face of traditionally received Victorian patriarchal gender conventions. For her, sexuality is not only unproblematic, it is a necessary part of her being. illustrated during a very early encounter with Jude. He's the sort of man I long for. I shall go mad if I can't give myself to him altogether. I felt I should when I first saw him. And let's face it, launching a pig's penis at someone is hardly an ambiguous statement of intent. Likened by Margaret Oliphant to a human pig, Arabella is what Richard Le Gallienne observed as somewhat too obviously animal. In fact, Hardy wrote to fellow novelist Catherine McCoyd in 1874 that he had no great liking for the perfect woman of fiction, believing that there are women quite worthy enough in nature to satisfy any reasonable being, but he ventured to think that they too frequently do not exhibit that nature truly and simply, and thus the nature is condemned by their critics. When Hardy created Arabella, he perhaps was not quite prepared for the reaction of horror and disgust she aroused in both readers and critics alike, and still does. But I admire Arabella Don precisely because she explodes stereotypical notions of femininity while remaining distinctly feminine, yet encapsulates in Darwinian terms what is possibly Hardy's most definitive alpha male character. Only one of Hardy's novels focuses exclusively on the ideology of martial masculinities, the trumpet major. Invariably dismissed by critics both contemporary and modern as his weakest novel, indeed Professor Richard Nemesfari goes as far as to liken the trumpet major to a Jane Austen novel run slightly out of control, John Loveday is an understated character. He is responsible, dependable, and morally sound, chivalrous, obedient, and quietly spoken. Hardy's friend, J.M. Barrie, the playwright of Peter Pan, thought Loveday a brave and gallant soldier, part of England's greatness, he wrote. But his presence does not leave any marked impression upon the rest of the narrative cast, and this honest and diligent man is not rewarded for his courage and steadfastness with the hand of the novel's heroine. He is passed over in favour of his fickle brother, and is ultimately silenced forever upon one of the bloody battlefields of Spain. By having the eponymous character dwell on the periphery of events, the contrast between him and the braggadocio yeoman Festus Derriman becomes more pronounced, making Hardy's caricature of martial masculinity, that is, of soldiers, in this novel much more apparent to the reader. Festus is a vain boor who boasts fierce as appliances about his person, such as great boots with formidable spurs, and he refers to himself as a warrior. He drinks heavily and swears loudly, and is quite frankly a creation of comic genius. It was tacitly acknowledged by 19th century society that the elite status of the yeomanry set them apart as models of chivalric manliness. The chivalric code comprised courage, honour, courtesy, and justice, especially in the conduct of a man towards a woman. Festus Derriman, a member of the yeoman cavalry, is the antithesis of such behaviour. While having pretensions towards the status of alpha male, simply by virtue of his colossal stature and moneyed connections, Festus is in fact portrayed by Hardy as a figure of hilarity. He is about the size and weight of the Farnese Hercules, and his deep stentorian voice speaks in tones that shook window panes, and he is full of the conviction that by simply entering a premises, he bestows pleasure upon the assembled company. Yet Derriman is prone to sulking like a cross baby, and his favourite refrain is, "Dash my wig!" a phrase symbolizing his utter shallowness. Song lyrics of the time in which the trumpet major is set during the threat of Napoleonic invasion sums Festus up quite aptly. I don't want the sergeant's shilling, I don't want to be shot down. I'm really much more willing to make myself a killing living off the pickings of the ladies of the town. Festus spends the bulk of the narrative chasing the heroine Anne Garland, in some instances literally chasing her, searching for his uncle's secret cache of money, or avoiding any duties involving physical exertion. And Hardy signals the full extent of Festus's impotence during a scene where Anne secrets herself inside an abandoned house, waiting for aid and news of the Napoleonic threat. Festus espies her and immediately attempts to gain entry. When Anne refuses him, he becomes indignant and enraged. "Dash my wig then," he cried, his face flaming up. "I'll find a way to get in. Now don't you provoke me. You don't know what I'm capable of." When she still disallows him ingress, Hardy has Festus petulantly threaten Anne. "Now, damn my wig, I will get at you. You've tried me beyond endurance. One kiss would have been enough in that day in the mead. Now I will have 40, whether you will or no." And being the charming fellow that he is, he flings himself at the door, rather fruitlessly, and then tries to drive his sword between the joints of the window shutters in an attempt to rip them open. The result being that the sword snaps off in his hand. To add insult to injury, the terrified Anne manages to escape on Derriman's own horse, when he goes in search of a ladder to help him enter a higher window in order to reach her. A character described by the narrator as the florid son of Mars is in fact brought to the level of a eunuch. If the alpha male occupies one extreme of the masculinity spectrum, we can take it as read that the androgyne is placed at the other. Aeneas Manston and Will Dare are defined by an ambiguous, diaphanous beauty. While Aeneas Manston is extremely handsome, the most striking thing about his appearance is the almost preternatural clearness of his complexion and its smoothness. Manston's manner is elegant, and his face rather too delicately beautiful. Indeed, his marvellous beauty is remarked upon repeatedly by the narrator throughout Desperate Remedies. As an androgyne, Manston's features seem to exhibit an equal amount of both male and female aspects. While he is handsome, well-formed, and speaks in a clear masculine voice, a dangerous effeminacy is also apparent in the many ambivalent comments by the narrator on Manston's gender. His lips are full and luscious to a surprising degree, possessing a woman-like softness of curve, and an intense ruby redness. Manston's face is described as too delicately beautiful, yet the effect of his form and features upon womankind en masse is that of the alpha male. Hardy even adopts a phrase from evolutionary discourse, the law of natural selection, to account for his character's attractive qualities. Manston is Byronic, a sensuous villain, and while he may be rendered as possessing a number of feminine physical features, in the very first scene in which he appears in the novel, Manston's masculinity is electric, endowed with a sense of primal urgency, symbolized by the storm which surrounds he and Cytherea. Lightning darts, forks, and zigzags, and the thunder and rain increase to a terrific force, while Manston plays powerfully upon an organ, the music produced entering into Cytherea with a gnawing thrill. Cytherea is mesmerized, shrinking up beside him and looking with parted lips at his face. The sexual frisson between the two characters is palpable. Desperate Remedies is a novel which explores the unstable nature of gender, remarkable for being Hardy's first published novel. Miss Aldclyffe is repeatedly referred to as displaying a number of masculine traits, both in appearance and manner. There was a severity of the lower outlines of the face which gave a masculine cast to this portion of her countenance. Womanly weakness was nowhere visible. Her character is forceful in a way that Hardy's contemporaries would have associated with the masculine public sphere. Owen Gray, Cytherea's brother, is suddenly stricken with lameness when Edward Springrove, her original suitor, is introduced. Springrove himself is equally emasculated, becoming a piner rather than a romantic hero, conceding to Manston's androgynous yet superior masculinity. He becomes a sight sad beyond all description, a spectre-thin figure whose actions seemed beyond his own control. Manston takes Springrove's potential employment position as steward to Miss Aldclyffe, and then claims Springrove's potential wife. Both Edward and Owen's masculinities are belittled by an androgyne, who by the law of natural selection is able to affect womankind en masse. The complex nature of the masculinity spectrum is highlighted by how Manston problematizes Victorian notions of manliness. His sexuality is a dangerous union of womanly sensuality with manly aggressiveness, an unconventional amalgam which was to 19th century readers a threat to the patriarchal status quo. In this novel, Hardy's heroes are always lacking in some way, but his too delicately beautiful androgynous villain is portrayed as asserting a superior masculinity that valorizes what many of Hardy's contemporaries denigrated. Fatherhood was important for defining and reinforcing the young adult male identity. Children were traditionally subject to their father, as he was expected to provide for them because they were not, until 21 years of age, of an age recognized to have attained reason. The actions of the son reflected upon the father. Therefore, moral guidance was of paramount importance. Hardy's other androgynous villain, Will Dare, from a Laodicean, is domineering and displays a certain amount of vitality, but he is not the most successful or physically powerful male protagonist in that novel. It is Captain de Stancy who appears to conform to the authoritarian role. The figure of the soldier was an important trope of empire and adventure fiction, used as a tool for the promotion of an energetic Christian evangelism combined with vigour and virility. Figures such as the celebrated Duke of Wellington ensured that the soldier became embedded within the Victorian consciousness as symbolising authority, valour and great physical strength. He was also the favourite of Charlotte Bronte. Captain de Stancy displays the manly requisites of imposing stature, physical prowess, a deep and resonant voice, and, of course, a proud set of whiskers. In contrast, his son William Dare, who possesses many androgynous qualities, more than Aeneas Manston, in fact, is illegitimate. Yet it is this character whom Hardy has chosen to act as the centre of control within the narrative, usurping the role of paterfamilias and reducing his upstanding military father to the status of a Pavlovian clown. Will Dare is presented by the narrator as a person quite out of the common. His age is impossible to ascertain. There was not a hair upon his face which could serve to hang a guess upon. In repose he appeared a boy, but his actions were so completely those of a man. Dare wears his hair parted in the middle, hung as a fringe or valance above in the fashion sometimes affected by the other sex. Yet there is a swagger in his body and limbs, a latent power. Charlotte de Stancy can't think whether he is a boy or a man, and the architect Havel refers to Dare as a complete negative. He is not a woman, but whether man or boy, people cannot tell. And Hardy's narrator refers to Dare variously as the boy man, an unpedestaled Dionysus, and the Etruscan youth Tages. The Dionysian comparison serves to both aestheticize and eroticize Dare's body, a fate more usually reserved in Victorian literature and art for the female form. Will Dare is cast in the role of villain by narrative circumstance. He's a legitimate progeny of a respected army captain who himself had stood to inherit Stancy Castle until it was lost to a Mr. Wilkins, partly through racing speculations, partly in other ways. The mind boggles. Though publicly acknowledged by the surname of Dare, symbolically denoting his challenge to societal conventions in order to reclaim what he feels to be his legacy, privately Will's true patriot lineage is tattooed above his heart, de Stancy. If Captain de Stancy were to marry the novel's heroine, Paula Power, the current owner of Stancy Castle, Dare's birthright would be restored. To achieve this end, the boy man adopts the role of the father. His father, by contrast, seems to take that of the son. For though Captain de Stancy is admirably made, and his every move exhibited a fine combination of strength and flexibility of limb, he admits to his son, Willie, that, it seems to me, of us two, it is you who exercises paternal authority. Dare knows what a marvellous match it would make if his father and Paula were to unite. Interestingly, Dare displays no sexual attraction for Paula himself, though he is much closer in age to her than she is to the captain, and urges him along this route with the reproof that it would make a man of you, and I have set my mind upon your putting no objection in the way of its accomplishment. This is a son talking to his father. A son was expected to be dutiful and respectful to his father, accepting his guidance on education, religion, and career choices. No such relationship exists between Dare and his father. The captain has been absent from much of his son's life, and rather than guidance, he simply provides money, which he hopes will keep Dare away. Dare never addresses de Stancy as father, but rather as captain, and continually admonishes the older man to trust to my good sense. He looks upon his father as a Frankenstein, whom he has vamped up, and when for a moment Will's ambitious experiments seemed likely to be rewarded by his discomfiture at the hands of his own creature, he expostulates to the captain that it is he, the son, who has been working so hard to get you on in life and make a rising man of you. De Stancy acquiesces. It is as if you were the parent and I the son. The most startling and therefore best demonstration of this inverted familial exchange occurs at the novel's denouement. Dare's indictment of his military hero father's paternal fitness. See what I have done for you. You have been my constant care and anxiety for I can't tell how long. I have stayed awake at night thinking how I might best give you a good start in the world by arranging this judicious marriage, when you have been sleeping as sound as a top, with no cares upon your mind at all. This is not an example of a disappointed father reprimanding a recalcitrant son. What the reader is shocked into realizing is that this is Hardy delineating an illegitimate androgyne addressing a highly respected member, senior member of the armed forces. The captain is ultimately jilted by the heroine, Paula Power, and Wildair is not only denied his legacy, but his very birthright. Yet by articulating a subordinate and stigmatized masculinity, as usurping that which was traditionally granted to the alpha male figure of a father and a military man, Hardy is able to impugn the autonomy of Victorian patriarchy, complicating and subverting 19th century constructions of masculinities. Sigmund Freud's theory of das Unheimliche, or the uncanny, describes that which is eerie, weird, possibly arousing a sense of fear. The otherness of the uncanny features in Hardy's The Return of the Native, the publication of which The Times, in November 1878, described as taking the reader farther from the madding crowd than ever before. Hardy's reaction to this was to write as his New Year's thought for 1879 that a perception of the failure of things to be what they are meant to be lends them, in place of the intended interest, a newer and greater interest of an unintended kind. Diggory, then, is an instance of the failure of things as they are meant to be, who fails to conform to the conventions set by society, whom Hardy invests with a newer and greater interest of an unintended kind. He occupies a position removed from the status quo, otherworldly, seemingly alienated from both his fellow protagonists and Hardy's readers. Then is a Reddell man by trade, who lives like a gypsy on Egdon Heath, remaining for the most part out of sight of the other denizens. He is aloof, isolated, not of them. As a result of his trade, his skin is coloured red. The narrator informs us that he was not temporarily overlaid with colour, it permeated him. When he suddenly looms from the darkness, the folk of the heath believe that they have been visited by the devil or the red ghost, and Timothy Fairway refers to them as a fiery mommet who puts in a turn. Through him, Hardy created what J.O. Bailey memorably described as a Mephistophelian visitant. The sight of him arouses horror in young children. The Reddell man is coming for you had been the formulated threat of Wessex mothers for many generations. While the character of Venn is viewed as exterior to his community, he is at the same time an integral part of it. Vital to the well-being of both the heath and its inhabitants, he acts as the fulcrum upon which the plot of the novel revolves. Hardy never makes the reader privy to Ben's thoughts, only the resultant actions. He sees much, acts accordingly, but says very little, and displays an uncanny ability to suddenly appear exactly when and where he can be most instrumental to others. When Tamsin Yeobright wishes to return home in secret after her disastrous first wedding attempt with Damon Wildeve, Venn is there to transport her across the heath within the confines of his van. When Wildeve, through a game of dice, cheats the hapless Christian Cantle out of the money Cantle had been sent to deliver to Tamsin by her aunt, The tall crimson form of the Riddle Man slowly rose from behind a neighbouring bush, and with only a few well-placed, taunting words, immediately wins the money back from Wild Eve in order to deliver it to its rightful recipient. And again, towards the conclusion of the novel, when Eustacia slips and falls into Shadwater Weir, with Wild Eve plunging after her and Clem unsuccessfully attempting a rescue, then suddenly appears and coolly and logically retrieves all three characters from the water. Spoiler, though only Clem has survived. The combination of otherworldly qualities with which Hardy has invested this character, red skin, silence, sudden appearances, uncanny harmony with the landscape of the heath, designate him as marginal, as other. Diggory then represents a liminal but very valid masculinity, through which he can act as that which he cannot express. An uncanny figure, viewed suspiciously by his fellow protagonists, but without whom they could not form a fully integrated society. Before the appearance of Darwin's The Descent of Man in 1879, doctors defined gender according to a doctrine of appropriate appearance and behaviour. Hermaphroditism was considered an aberration, and a programme of gender reassignment attempted to ensure that persons displaying questionable sexual characteristics were designated correctly male or female. As one may expect, the consequences were often disastrous. Thomas Leaf and Christian Cantle are unmen. They do not share the androgynous aspects of characters such as Aeneas Manston and Will Dare. They seem not to display any physical or social characteristics regarded as particular to either sex. Freud argued that all humans are constitutionally bisexual, as both masculine and feminine currents exist within everyone, he said. Rather than being bisexual in this Freudian sense, Hardy's representations of Leaf and Cantle are more asexual in orientation, excuse me, each occupying a sexually indeterminate space within the masculinity spectrum. Through Leaf and Cantle, Hardy represents an extreme liminality that is used as a yardstick by which to gauge the masculinities of the other protagonists and by which they may measure each other. Thomas Leaf, in Under the Greenwood Tree, may be seen as an early attempt by Hardy at delineating an alternative gender perspective. He displays a weak lath-like form and stumbles along with one shoulder forward and his head inclined to the left, his arms dangling nervelessly. If we juxtapose this with the image emphasised of Dick Dewey, placed upon ordinary shaped nose, ordinary chin, ordinary neck, and ordinary shoulders, the novel's central character, Dick Dewey, it is immediately apparent that Leaf is extraordinary. He is a human skeleton in a smock frock, very awkward in his movements. But before the reader can become disconcerted, Hardy adds the qualification, apparently on account of having grown so very fast that before he'd had time to get used to his height, he was higher. This character is portrayed as never having understood the notion of physical attractiveness, and thus the arrival of Fancy Day to the village leaves him uncertain as to how he should react after hearing all of the other men praise her beauty. In addition, he seems to show not the least hesitation in comparing himself to a woman when trying to defend his singing ability. I can sing my treble as well as any maid or married woman either, and better. Yet though he is described by the other characters as having a reedy voice, ghastly looks, and no head, he is accepted by them as a valid member of the community. Professor Angelique Richardson notes that even Leaf's name signals his belonging to the organic whole. For such a liminal entity to achieve effortless integration into society can be construed as anathema to the eugenicist position of Hardy's contemporaries, such as Max Nordau and Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin. Grant Allen argued for the preeminence of biological beauty in his book Physiological Aesthetics of 1877, saying that should any society prefer the morbid to the sound, then that race must be on the high road to extinction. Through the construction of Leaf's particular masculinity, Hardy is ranging himself in opposition to thinkers like Grant Allen. Leaf is an example of resistance to a eugenicist dialectic. Eugenicists who feared that the inclusion of the morbid would lead to extinction. This is best illustrated when Thomas Leaf appears at the wedding, spoilers again, of Dick, Dewey and Fancy Day at the novel's conclusion. At first, members of the community are dubious as to his appearance on such a public occasion, until the tranter gently explains why this inelegant, effeminate youth should be welcomed. Suppose we must let him come. His looks are against an Annie is terrible silly, but I've never been in jail and won't do no harm. And when Geoffrey bids Leaf thou welcomest know, he is not inviting the extinction of the Mellstock community. He is instead bringing new social arrangements into being, acceptance of the morbid, of the unman. The character of Christian Cantle in The Return of the Native is rendered more explicitly neuter, or third sex. He is the unman to Diggory Venn's other. References to Cantle's liminal masculinity are much more prevalent throughout this text. Hardy's representation of Leaf was, Cantle being a more fully developed character, his intention with his fellow protagonists more involved, his interactions. Like Leaf, Cantle's appearance is awkward to the point of abnormality. He is, according to fellow character Timothy Fairway, a slack-twisted, slim-looking Maphrodite fool, and a faltering man with reedy hair, no shoulders, and a great quantity of wrist and ankle beyond his clothes, who speaks in a thin, gibbering voice. Emphasis is also placed upon his designation as the man no woman will marry, due to suspicions that he is a man of no moon, a hermaphrodite. Christian was born during the interval between an old moon and the first appearance of a new one, which, according to Egdon Heath folklore, identifies him with the saying, no moon, no man. As his character admits of himself, "'Tis said I be only the reins of a man, and no good in the world at all." But as with Leaf, this unman is also included as a member of the community in his own right. Wethers must live their time as well as other sheep, poor soul. Wethers are rams who have been castrated before reaching sexual maturity. With reference to the masculinity assigned to Cantle's character, the novel's other protagonists periodically exhort Christian to lift up your spirits like a man, and his father, Granfred Cantle, at times despairs of his son's complete lack of machismo. Really all the soldiering and smartness in the world, and the father seems to count for nothing in forming the son. But traditional patriarchal expectations are subverted by one who describes himself as a brockle hit. The rest of the Egdon community do not show a preference for the sound over the morbid. Cantle is instead instructed by Timothy Fairway to never pitch yourself in such a low key as that. Hardy does not castigate this no-moon man's lack of manliness. Rather, he illustrates, through his portrayal of Cantle, the unfeasibility of human conformity. The first overtly homosocial relationship to appear in Hardy's novelistic earth is that between Stephen Smith and Henry Knight in A Pair of Blue Eyes. Stephen is repeatedly described by the narrator in feminine terms. He is a pretty youth, with pink cheeks, a perfect Cupid's bow mouth, a boyish blush and manner, and a boyish voice. A very blooming boy, with a constitution built rather after a feminine than a male model. His character is portrayed as constantly striving for, but never quite attaining, a masculinity which displays what he deems to be the correct qualities for a man to be loved for. He believes that such qualities are evinced by his mentor, Henry Knight, and the language he uses when describing Knight to Elfried Swancourt clearly shows his equation of intellect with manliness. Knight is respectively the noblest man in the world, the best and cleverest man in England, and 1 in 1,000. Stephen's fervent exclamation to Alfred, "Shan't I be glad when I get richer and better educated and hob and nob with him," displays an alarming naivety as to what constitutes worthiness. The artlessness with which his character has been endowed contrasts, as expected, with Knight's condescending and patronising sense of self-importance. Knight's constant addressing of Stephen as "my boy" and Elfried as "little woman" bespeaks a superiority that his persona does nothing to merit. What becomes apparent to the reader early in the narrative is that Knight's character is not the epitome of gentlemanly perfection that Stephen wishes to emulate, but a study in misogyny and repression. Knight lives a cloistered, claustrophobic life in a room at Bede's Inn as a literary critic and essayist, though the plaque on his door proclaims him as barrister at law. The room smells of tobacco and contains a chaotic assemblage of articles, from which the only discernible sound is that of the spasmodic scratching of a quill pen. The pen is Knight's sword, through which he wields the power to further or destroy a writer's career at will. He lives a life of self-denial, urging on asceticism, and the reader may perceive him as brandishing a pen as a phallus to compensate for the lack of self-gratification in his life. His character is delineated as one who has concocted a great deal of paper theory on social amenities and modern manners generally, though the special ounce of practice is wanting. When Stephen asks his mentor for relationship advice, Knight's reply is indicative of his general aloofness. "All I know about women, or men either, is a mass of generalities." In line with his position as a critic of novels, Knight is shown as knowing human nature only in theory, not in practice. Reference is made on a number of occasions to Knight's peculiarity of nature and fastidiousness. He declares to Elfried his taste for untried lips, and this man of 32 with experienced mind has still never given a woman a kiss in my life except my mother. Make of that what you will. But Knight is confident in the knowledge that Stephen adores him, as a man is very rarely adored by another in modern times, due to the reverence with which his disciple regards him. Stephen looked with affectionate awe at a master whose mind he believed could swallow up in one meal all his own head contained. Women are unknown quantity tonight, and it is when Elfried is added to the equation that the relationship between the two men is expanded to form an erotic triangle. The student-mentor arrangement begins to degenerate into a boyish rivalry. Towards the end of the tale, the men reunite after a brief estrangement in a courtship narrative of their own, which encompasses selfishness, jealousy, regret, constraint, questioning, and resolution. They compete to see who can reach Elfried first in order to propose marriage. They interrogate each other's motives and indulge in jealous accusations of interference and domineering. Upon discovering, spoiler alert, that Elfried has in fact died, Knight and Smith read the inscription on her coffin plate as if animated by one soul. Stephen then puts his hand on Knight's arm and they retire into the darkness. Now that the physical manifestation of Elfried's character has been removed from the plot, she is reduced to, as what Philip Mallet states, a medium of exchange in the discursive web of homosociality. Critics have found Michael Henchard tragic and misogynistic by turns. A detractor writing in the Saturday Review in 1886 was scornful of the character's lack of credibility, finding it impossible to believe that the metamorphosis from wife-seller into a man of considerable delicacy, honour and generosity could happen at all. Contrast this with a review appearing in The Spectator only a month later, in which it is remarked that Mr. Hardy has not given us any more powerful study than that of Michael Henchard, referring to Henchard as a hero and a character par excellence. Professor Elaine Showalter, in common with other feminist writers of the 1970s and 1980s, viewed Henchard first and foremost as a misogynist, believing this to be at the root of his homosociality. Given Henchard's misogyny, we cannot be surprised to see that his deepest feelings are reserved for another man, she wrote. Through Henchard, Hardy represents a masculinity of extremes. An aggressive and domineering alpha male in his dealings with the other inhabitants of Casterbridge, a man of character who becomes disconcertingly unmanned through his excessive affection for another male, and a tragic figure whose instability is rooted in episodes of deep depression. In comparison, Farfrae appears emotionally stunted. His cold modernisms clashes with the older man's regard for the patriarchal values of an earlier generation. And it is this juxtaposition in temperament that both creates and destroys an essentially homosocial relationship. Farfrae symbolises a masculinity that evaluates people and machinery in equal economic terms. Henchard is portrayed as displaying a masculine identity that is tragically obsolete. Where Farfrae is intellectual, Henchard is physical. If Farfrae tends to avoid showing emotion, Henchard shows no hesitation in exhibiting overtly physical displays of affection, while making such declarations as, "Hang it, Farfrae, I like thee well," and "My heart is true to you still." Henchard compensates for his illiteracy with a bull-headedness and reliance upon his hands. Farfrae's form of manhood is predicated upon detached calculation and professionalism. Henchard's attraction to Farfrae is immediate. "When a man takes my fancy, he takes it strong," perhaps because he sees the young man's reserve as an anchor for his own volatility. Their relationship resembles that of a Victorian romance novel, with the older man courting the younger, who is at first submissive out of economic necessity. There is a honeymoon period of inseparability, with Henchard laying his arm familiarly along Farfrae's shoulders as they walk together, and his constant liking to have Farfrae near him. Jealousy over a third party, Lucetta Templeman as a part of another erotic triangle. An irreconcilable rift after a confrontation, Henchard's attack on Farfrae during the primal scene in the barn, and, spoiler, the tragic death of one of the lead protagonists. But unlike a typical romance narrative, it is not the younger, submissive partner who dies, but the older and experienced alpha male. Henchard's naturally tigerish affection fails to pierce Farfrae's sociopathic veneer, and the former is left unmanned after the fight in the hayloft, though he is physically the stronger, tying one arm behind his back in order to not be perceived as taking advantage of the other man who is less robust. The young man's composition, yet still commands Henchard's heart, and while he begins in the ascendancy, he ends in a crouching attitude, unusual for such a man. For such a man, its womanliness sat tragically on the figure of so stern a piece of virility. Even in defeat, he declares his love for his opponent, though he meets with a stony silence. And at the novel's conclusion, Henchard ends broken and emasculated, with a wish for personal obliteration. And while there is no indication within the text of a sexual relationship between Henchard and Farfrae, it is undeniably a text which is both homosocial and homoerotic. Henry Knight's homosociality in A Pair of Blue Eyes and his misogyny both spring from innate sexual repression. Knight has never formed a deep attachment, for he claims he has never found a woman worth it. He pontificates that the best thing to hear about a woman is that she has married, and then to hear no more about her. And he most prizes a woman's skill in effacement. The last comment is made to Elfriede, while the two are playing chess. In this scene, Hardy represents the need for suppression of the female by the male, which is a defining characteristic of Knight's misogyny. Hardy employs the language of battle, victim, merciless appropriation, cold-blooded, and enemy, emphasizing Knight's wish to subjugate through a chess match. And Knight smiles pitilessly as he checkmates Elfriede repeatedly, informing her that, "Madam, you shall not win." Hardy's narrator then has Knight guess at Elfriede's age, quipping that all girls are 17. Presumably, because one older than this, there is a chance that her lips have indeed been tried, and she is therefore sullied. Such broad generalizations, coupled with the irony of Knight's name, hint at an authorial contempt for such sexual rigidity on Hardy's part. The reactions of readers to Hardy's construction of Henchard tend first and foremost to be perceptions of this character as a misogynist, and this is usually due to the opening episode of The Mayor of Casterbridge. Hardy's presentation of a wife sale invokes images of male mastery and female subjugation, more morally compromising than Knight's attack on Elfriede through the medium of a chess battle. But recent critical attention has given credence to a different interpretation of the wife sale scene. Sumay Uhura and Neil Sargent have both highlighted the ambiguous nature of Henchard's wife Susan's acquiescence in the transaction. Uhura points out that reducing Susan to a mere chattel is to ignore the fact that the sale itself would not have been settled without her consent. This often overlooked circumstance is taken up and expanded upon by Professor Sargent, an associate professor of law, who recounts in detail the legal ramifications of such events in order to show that Susan's character was in no way as ignorant of the transaction taking place as many readers suppose. Her moral virtue is not compromised, while public opinion is weighted in favour of her as an unwilling participant, yet Hardy does not deny her character a voice. She announces to the crowd at Waden Prior's Fair that her present owner is not at all to her liking, and though cautioned not to by an onlooker of the proceedings, she readily stands up to be appraised by potential bidders and bows her head with absolute indifference. The narrator makes it clear that this exchange cannot take place without Susan's full agreement, and this she gives, while declaring that she will try her luck elsewhere. Susan Newson, nee Henchard, spends no less than 18 satisfactory years with her purchaser, with whom she has a child. As her child with Henchard had died in infancy, the new baby is also christened Elizabeth Jane, which for the purposes of the plot proves to be rather fortunate. When she is successful 20 years later in seeking out Henchard after what she believes to be her husband's death, Susan does not disclose to him the true paternity of her now grown-up child, and he, believing he owes her a moral debt, remarries Susan, thus becoming legal guardian of the daughter Elizabeth Jane, whom he mistakenly believes is his. Susan does nothing to disabuse him of this notion. Thus both of these female characters become considerably financially prosperous under Henchard's protection. There are enough ambiguities in Hardy's text to support a rebuttal of the popular critical interpretation of Michael Henchard as a misogynist. Hardy recognised the multi-layered nature of masculinity and of the potentially devastating effects of having these layers stripped back. In his novels, Hardy often delineates certain disturbed psychological states, including obsessions, delusions, and hysteria. He demonstrates an interest in the workings of the mind from his earliest novels, but Far from the Madding Crowd is the first to pinpoint a specific psychosis, that of monomania, and to record the process of mental breakdown. It is clear from the very introduction to the novel that William Boldwood is an unfathomable quantity, and his masculinity is called into question immediately. Though he is described by Bathsheba's maid Liddy as very handsome and rich, she also claims that he is such a hopeless man for a woman. Boldwood has been courted by 6s and 7s. Everywhere. When Bathsheba first enters the Corn Exchange in Casterbridge, Boldwood never turned his head once. Bathsheba and the farm activities around him. Sexuality appears to be alien to Boldwood's nature, and the Valentine Bathsheba sends him frolicsomely Boldwood. Hardy's narrator attributes to Boldwood's parlour the atmosphere of a Puritan Sunday lasting all week, but upon receipt of the Valentine, he the symmetry of his existence to this naughty. In fact, this character has led a life of it, and a bachelor on a number of occasions. But Bathsheba's childish game of an idle minute awakens astounding wells of fevered feeling in a still man. Boldwood exhibits symptoms associated with what Thomas Mayo in 1834 and James Pritchard in 1835 described as moral insanity, a term which was an early instance of the gendering of madness. Where hysteria was considered a feminine malady, masculinity was susceptible to the condition of moral insanity. It was thought to be caused by a number of factors, including unrequited love, domestic troubles, grief and economic pressures, or simply overwork. One manifestation of moral insanity was what the French physician Jean-Étienne Esquerot called in 1845 monomania, in which delirium is limited to one or a small number of objects. The object of Boldwood's monomania is Bathsheba Everdeen, his fixation serving to remove any awareness of her as an actual person. The previously solid and reserved yeoman, whose residence is at once an almonry and a cloister, and whose stillness struck casual observers more than anything else about him, transforms into a hotbed of tropic intensity, and Boldwood begins to live outside his defences for the first time. As the obsession with Bathsheba intensifies, Boldwood appears to lose moral character, becoming instead an example of psychological emasculation. Hardy's portrayal of Boldwood is a tentative exploration of neurosis, and this is evident in his reaction upon receiving the valentine from Bathsheba at the beginning. The normally solemn and reserved man is suddenly thrown into a state of nervous excitability, and his eyes are now widespread and vacant. It is the reception of Bathsheba's seemingly innocuous valentine that signals the onset of Boldwood's mental deterioration. After a period of time, during which Bathsheba implicitly gives Boldwood reason to believe that she will be courted by him and ultimately engaged to him, she instead chooses another, and asks of the gentleman farmer, "How was I to know that what is a pastime to all other men was death to you?" As we witness Boldwood's eventual breakdown, leading to, spoiler, his shooting of his rival Sergeant Troy, followed by his own suicide attempt, we are able to recognise the signs of a developing psychosis. There had showed in him, Boldwood, unequivocal symptoms of the mental derangement with which Bathsheba and Oak, alone of all others, and at different times, had momentarily suspected. Somewhat pathetic evidences of a mind crazed with care and love. The conviction that Boldwood had not been morally responsible for his later acts now became general. Facts elicited previous to the trial had pointed strongly in the same direction, but they had not been of sufficient weight to lead to an order for an examination into the state of Boldwood's mind. It was astonishing now that a presumption of insanity was raised, how many collateral circumstances were remembered, to which a condition of mental disease seemed to afford the only explanation. I was going to talk at this point about Clym Yeobride as Oedipus Rex, Jude Fawley as an inferior Tantalus, Henchard, again, because he's one of my favourites, as an aggressive melancholic, but there isn't enough time, and we've already looked at Henchard in some detail. Mind you, is there any such thing as too much Henchard? Especially when he's played by Kieran Hines. Now, I'm very aware of the time, and I'm afraid I will not be able to finish my paper, but that is the end of that section. And thus I will say the end of my paper for today, because I have taken up rather a lot of your time. So there is my final slide. Researcher in Hardy Masculinities, Victorian Studies, the Gothic, and a dedicated admirer of Thomas Hardy's Men. If anybody would like to get in contact with me, there is my email address. More than happy to speak to anybody. Sorry to cut that short, and I will now stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I don't know about I don't know about my students. I don't know about the other listeners. Like, I was deeply engrossed for obvious reasons. It's Hardy, but thank you so much. It was so thorough, and it was so concise, and so many strands woven together in this one particular talk. And my semester 2 students, I had left out masculinity and the discussions on Alec and Angel, because I wanted them to listen to you first. But then the interesting part of it, because you were talking about gender, and as we take pride in Hardy thinking of himself, and we thinking of Hardy as 50 or 100 years ahead of his time, always through his works, and the way that these categories, these brilliant categories of men that he did produce in his work, and way ahead of his times. Of course, he was writing in the very, very sort of strict Victorian times. So it also brings us very close to fourth wave feminism, which many of my students can identify with. So we are even touching Butler. So that is fascinating. that is really fascinating for me as a teacher of Hardy, taking Hardy beyond the confines of being just a canonical writer, somebody who can be read and reread and looked at in so many different ways, that he is already being done so brilliantly. Unfortunately, not in India, but elsewhere. So again, maybe your talk is going to be inspirational for more people to sort of read Hardy and look at Hardy as not just a 19th century writer. And with this, I will, do you have some time for questions? To take questions?
I do have a few minutes, because I cut off the entire end section of my paper, because I was very conscious of the time.
Yes. Maybe, I don't know if there are questions in the chat box, but I'll hand over the session, the question answer session, to our PhD scholar, Annesha Sengupta, who's going to find out if there are questions or comments. And it's going to be very brief, Annesha, because I think Tracy has another lecture scheduled. And after this, we will have a very short vote of thanks by one of our students, and we end the program. Okay. Over to you, Annesha.
Am I audible?
Yes, but very quietly.
Yes, I can see there is one question. Thank you, Indralati, and thank you, Dr. Hayes, for your intriguing, fascinating talk. We stand amazed and mesmerized. There is one question from Deboshi Roy. She says, thank you for this illuminating session. Her question is, how can the binary construction of rural-urban masculinity be elucidated through Hardy's novels? That is the question.
Quite honestly, the most perfect novel for that rural binary would be The Mayor of Casterbridge, I would say, because not only is it one of his most rural novels, it is the novel that most perfectly illustrates the move from the rural way of life to the urban way of life. The principal character, Michael Henchard, you may have noticed I quite like him. He represents the old-fashioned rural man of the earth who uses his hands rather than his brain. He's actually illiterate. He is then contrasted with the binary of Farfrae, Donald Farfrae, who actually has come down from Scotland, who is a champion of modern technology, who wants all the latest machinery. He's against doing things by hand the old-fashioned way. He's incredibly intelligent. He believes in doing everything by the book with the proper paperwork. He's so professional, to the point in my interpretation that I believe he is sociopathic. He simply does not look at people as people, whereas Henchard is extremely volatile and passionate, and he loves and hates in equal volumes, whereas Farfrae just feels nothing. Not for either of his two wives, I might add, but again, I must say this is only my personal interpretation, but it is based on little snippets Hardy provides, like when he's marrying Lucetta, in the middle of the wedding ceremony, he stops to finalise a deal purchasing wheat. Who does that? You can pretty be well assured that Henchard would not have done that. So I think that that is the novel of Hardy's, for me, which most perfectly demonstrates a rural binary of masculinity, with Henchard is the old rural and Farfrae is the new encroaching modernity from the urban. That's how I would answer that one. I hope that's okay.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes. The second question is from Polumi Kunju. She asks that she says that Thomas Hardy had announced that he would not write fiction again. What is the reason behind that?
He did actually keep writing fiction. Jude the Obscure was the last novel he wrote. He was very disillusioned with the criticism of it, but it was not his last published volume, because he edited The Well-Beloved, which had been published in 1892, gave it a different ending, and it was republished in 1897. So that's after Jude the Obscure. But also, he continued to write short stories. So he was still publishing fiction. But what we need to remember is that Thomas Hardy's first love, above all, was poetry. And he was writing poetry 20 years, no, that's probably an exaggeration, at least a decade before he ever wrote his first novel. So, he just didn't publish it until 1898. That's when his first volume of poetry was collected. It dated all the way back to the 1860s, and it went all the way up to the late 1890s, and that was his first collection of poetry. Of course, after the controversy of Jude the Obscure, when the Bishop of Wakefield apparently threw his copy into the fire of the novel, Hardy, who had always been very, very sensitive to criticism, said, "That's it, enough. Quite frankly, I don't need that, and I was never interested in specifically being a novel writer anyway." So he went back to his poetry, which he excelled at. He only just missed out on becoming a poet laureate and receiving the Nobel Prize for Literature, which you all will be aware was actually awarded that year to Rabindranath Tagore. Sorry if I've said that completely wrong, my apologies. So he didn't stop writing fiction, he just moved to a different form, and one that he had always preferred to begin with. And I just noticed something came up saying, what is martial masculinity? It's spelt M-A-R-T-I-A-L, and martial means the army, anything to do with soldiering and soldiers. So it's called martial masculinity because soldiers were expected to have a particular, specific representation of masculinity. And what Hardy did was to show how utterly ridiculous that these expectations of martial masculinity in the 19th century were. So he showed Captain de Stancy, who is up here in the army, as a silly little boy who took all his orders from his own son, who happened to be an androgynous villain and illegitimate. And he also showed Festus Derryman from the Trumpet Major as being a complete and utter fool, even though Festus himself believed that he was quite the gung-ho hero. So Hardy basically, as we say, took the mick out of martial masculinity, for want of a better word. He was very interested in showing society not just that they had the completely wrong idea of how to treat women, but they also had the wrong idea of how to treat men, because we're all people, and as he famously said in his poem afterwards, he was the man who used to notice such things. So, there we are. Owen Dreeler, my dear friend, I'm so sorry, but I know...
Yes. I know you have a lecture. No, I think Annesha will reserve that, and I'll send Shamakti's question to Tracy, and I'm sure she can answer by mail and some other time, or I'll try to sort it out with her myself. And I think, should I, Madhumita Di, would you we just want to gift you something, Tracy, because it's everything is virtual. We are unable to give you to anything at this talk.
Yeah.
So I will ask the head of the
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Tracy. And thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for giving your time. It was lovely, and I'm exactly a hardy person, so it was a regular, so I think it is for most of my students. Thank you so much. Okay, Shubhanu Rekha, please.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a great session. So, I have made this little thank you card for you. I hope you like it.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm honoured. Thank you very much, everybody. Oh my, a presentation is coming up. Oh my bless. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much.
We'll mail these to you.
Yes. Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yes, please. Oh, thank you all so much. And please do.
And if you could. Yes, sure, I'll send it to you. Just 2 more minutes. I know I'm keeping you because you already have a lecture, but since this lecture was directed towards the PG semester 2 students, so they have been waiting to thank you. And this is Lopamudra Noshkar, who's going to thank you on behalf of her semester and semester 4, and also our MPhil and PhD research scholars. So it's just going to take a minute. So be very short, very brief. Lopamudra, please thank Dr. Hayes. Over to you, Lopamudra.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, everyone, once again. So, ma'am, first of all, on behalf of each and every student out here, along with all the research scholars, I would just convey our heartiest regards to you for blessing us with your delightful presence in this evening, and we are really very thankful to you for embracing us with lot of your thoughts, your personal experiences, and your visions about Thomas Hardy. And now we can also definitely explore him, and we've come up with a lot more of our individual perspectives and individual aspects about him. And as we have Thomas Hardy in our syllabus, in this stage we are just trying to learn a lot more about him, and we are just put on some of our individualities in the ideas that already exist. So thank you so much, ma'am, for your consent, and thank you so much once again on behalf of all of us. And one last thing, I would just like to thank to all my department and respected faculty members for arranging such an important webinar, especially in this tough time. And this is indeed a very great evening for all of us and lifetime experience. So once again, I just want to thank you to all of you.
Thank you, I'm honoured. Thank you. And now
Thank
you, Lopamudra.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, bye, Tracy. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Speak to you later. Okay, bye.